thanks a lot for this very impressive presentation, and now we are passing the micro to our chair colleague Ikenna PASCHAL from Louvain, Belgique, and he will talk to us about trans-denominationality, exploring the reality of simultaneous plural allegiance in African Christianity. The micro is yours.
Good day, everyone. I'm sure after 3 days and 3 lectures this morning, some of us are a little bit exhausted, but I'll try. And I hope my PowerPoints are fanciful enough to keep you awake. I've also tried to translate some parts of the PowerPoint to help those who don't understand English. But if you find any mistake in the PowerPoints, please blame my people. Okay? All right. My paper starts with some sort of question, and we'll also end with some questions. And I will start with an anecdote. Last semester, I was teaching a course, Évangélisation dans un monde sécularisé. And I asked my students, do you know about the Swifties? And they have no idea. And 70% of them are priests. They have no idea of the Swifties or the Quimbees. And I asked, how are you going to evangelize this world if you don't know these concepts? And so what I've done is to follow where I think some of the young people, especially within the context of African Christianity, are going, to see whether there is something there. So it's a search, and I want you to search with me. So if you've been following the trend of large-scale youth-involved religious activities in Africa, and in African diaspora with the ecclesiological lens, I'm sure you would have encountered any or all of the following pictures that I'm going to show you now. So, this is called the Hallelujah Challenge, and it happens every year. And people who follow this program, apart from those who follow it on the ground, you have more than 500,000 people following it on YouTube. And then hundreds of thousands following it on Instagram and other sources. And most of them are young people. As you can see, the man who is in charge of this, Nathaniel Bassi, was already featured on CNN and all that. Okay? I show you another one. This is what they call New Season's prophetic prayers and declarations. It's the slogan is what God cannot do does not exist. And there are a lot of young people who want demonstration for their faith. And they follow this every 7 a.m. every day. Every day, 7 a.m. they are awake, following him from all around the world. And wherever he goes, the stadium are jam-packed. I mean, he shut down the, the Wembley Stadium in the UK. And he has been to Zambia, to the US, to every part of the world. And he's, by the way, the highest person who streams on YouTube in Nigeria. Nobody comes to us. Another one is what they call the experience. The experience is more like a music festival that is now up to 19 or 20 years. And what you see there is a picture of how packed the stadium is whenever they have this experience. And they have, the top gospel artists coming from all over the world to Nigeria for this event every December. And now, I'll say something later. Mirroring this kind of experience also is what you call the unusual praise, and this one is hosted by the Catholic Church. It started with the Catholic Church of Divine Mercy in Lekki, Lagos, and then after the Holy Trinity in Onitsha. So you look at it to find out that the Catholic Church is also mirroring this kind of events. And if you look at the first poster here, you see the same pastor who was this guy, Nathaniel Bassi, because he's a musician. You see him also here, okay? Invited by the Catholics. In fact, 70% of these musicians are not Catholics. They are not Catholics. And so, what is happening here? What you find in these gatherings is something that is slightly different from the usual Pentecostal gatherings. So normally, the usual Pentecostal gatherings are organized under denominations. And then after some time, the Pentecostals started organizing their programs under what you call interdenominational activities or non-denominational activities. And their idea is to break away from these attachments to ecclesial, communities, and to create a space where people can, freely relate. But in this case, they have gone a little step further. And that is what I'm trying to articulate with the idea of trans-denominationality, which operates at the subjective level. So at the subjective level, it is the individuals who decide to have a simultaneous plural allegiance or multiple religious identities. And I'll come back to this multiple religious identity because I think that is what grounds these things within the context of African Christianity. Now, the idea of trans-denominationality and the fact of a trans-denominational ecclesiology was first proposed by Jesuit theologian Roger Hayes as the quest for the fundamental elements of ecclesiology that cut across the different ecclesial communities in a way that transcends the diversities that one finds in Christianity today. And the goal for him is to reach for the historical and qualitative substance that binds the churches together as church. So what are the commonalities? This is what he was looking at. But for him, it never exists. He was using it as more like a constructive theology. And I'm trying to see, maybe within African Christianity, we can touch this kind of ecclesiology for the first time. And so, he demonstrated it in his book, Ecclesial Existence. But the question is transdimensionality and ecclesiology, is it theological? Is it a theological language? I know many people will not agree with that. In fact, the Anglican theologian Paul Alvis already describes denomination as a sociological thing. And in that sense, transdimensionality cannot be considered as a theological term. But when you see it as something that is happening within the context of the ecclesial circle, then you can give it as well a theological understanding. And so now I will return back to this idea of multiple religious identity. And the two books that helped in the 2000s, two books that came out immediately was the volume Vivre de plusieurs religions, And then Catherine Cornell's Many Mansions, Multiple Religious Belonging and Christian Identity. So these were the books that initially explored the idea of multiple religious identity within the context of the theology of religions. And so Cornell proposes 3 theological means of addressing and resolving the challenges and complexities that are associated with multiple religious belonging. I'll try to quickly go through them. So the first deals with focusing on the ultimate religious experience that is fundamental in all traditions. And this is predicated on the unicity of religious experiences irrespective of tradition one belongs to. The assumption here is that there is a universality to religious experience, both in the different religions and within the different denominations in each religion. The second one, according to her, requires remaining faithful to the symbolic framework of one tradition while adapting to the hermeneutical framework of another. So what comes to mind is the work by Douglas Pratt, being open and being faithful. The third one is that theology recognizes the possibility of is the acknowledgement of complementarity of religions. Okay, perhaps this is what is most evident within the inner Christian context, because, like I mentioned, this was used within the context of theology of religions. Now, beyond these 3 reasons, assumptions for multiple religious identity, Cornell also develops 5 forms of multiple religious belonging or identity. So 5 forms. You have, on the one hand, the involuntary, and on the other hand, the voluntary. The involuntary is like the cultural belonging, the family belonging. These things are the things that are given. You don't actually choose them, okay? In that sense. But the voluntary includes the occasional belonging, the believing without belonging. I know that most of us are aware of Grace Davy, who did a lot of work on this within the context of the United Kingdom. And then finally, the asymmetrical belonging. And I'd like to focus on that asymmetrical belonging. Because, this is what is very close to what I'm exploring here. Asymmetrical belonging emerges as an outcome of asymmetrical identity, since it involves belonging primarily to one religion while also identifying with another. Like other forms of voluntary belonging, the individual's subjective self plays a central role of choice making. And here, unlike others, the individual grounds his identity and belonging in a particular, say, Christian tradition, which becomes the basis and norm from which one comes to selectively identify with elements from one or more other traditions. So you find these young people, they may be Catholics, but they belong to NSPPD, they belong to, they attend the Hallelujah Challenge, but their primary identity is Catholic. While this form of belonging may be marked by unequal identification, it is also possible that it may lead to a shifting of a sense of primary belonging from one religion to another, or to a genuine sense of dividedness between 2 traditions, one tradition being normative in certain areas of life and other in other areas. So maybe when it comes to sacramental life, they attend the church, but when they want to hear better preaching, they go somewhere else. Or when they want to dance, they know where to go and dance better. Francis X. Clooney would argue that this model does not entail any repudiation of or unfaithfulness to prior enduring commitments. It's rather a kind of awakening, a maturation within Christian identity and vocation. So I will move to what I call the inner hybridization of Christian identity, because this is not just the theology of religion, but within Christianity. How does it show that we are, fundamentally, I would say, hybrids? Okay. So, that's Cornelia. And in her article, Religious Hybridity and Christian Identity, she says we are all hybrids. And then she goes on to mention the popular mixings that we have in the Christian tradition. In fact, if you go further, and I would like to do this, yeah. So if you read the ecclesiology of Gregor Maria Hoff, and also there's an interesting book he wrote on the Catholic-Lutheran dialogue, the Ikenna PASCHAL, Zwischen Identität and Differenz. He makes this clear. And also the book by Gideon Goshen, Hyphenated Christians. We are hyphenated Christians. That's a claim that our identity is not always pure as we claim. There's always something. In fact, even the Bible we are holding has part of it as the Jewish tradition and also the Christians. That's why it is called the Judeo-Christian religion. Now, the flexibility and dynamism of the Christian faith and identity does not only apply to its exchange with other religions and cultures, but also includes its internal exchange movements among the different ecclesial communities that claim the Christian identity. The relationship among the different ecclesial communities has often been marked by the negative element of division. We focus so much on division and the quest for unity. But then, we often do not pay attention to the internal movements and exchanges or transformative hybridization that happen among the churches. The ability to still maintain the central representative elements of each ecclesial community may have contributed to this neglect. Yet, the subjective accent of conceptual blending of believers implies shifts in the questions of identity and belonging. It is exactly these internal transformative hybridization movements that I've tried to conceptualize here as trans-denominationality. The motive is often the identification or perhaps the perception of a lack within the practice of a particular community. And so people feel something is lacking and they go look for what they think is lacking. So this recognition of a lack is a subjective, judgment of the individual believer, who reserves to himself or to herself the right to determine what is needed to satisfy a spiritual need. And this gets interesting when analyzed from the perspective of African Christianity. And so I will go to the African Christianity. Within African Christianity, the inner hybridization of identity is lived out in what Santillo calls the actual faith of believers. Of course, the actual faith is not to be fully articulated in any adequate or academic theological language. However, this faith possesses its own internal plausibility structures and logic, and is alive and constantly evolving beyond the restrictive sacramental systems and defined boundaries of what is spiritual or profane, or what is orthodox or syncretistic, outside the normative canon of a particular denomination. And so it is not something that is doctrinal or something that has been articulated by the church. No, it is people living their lives, their real lives, their lives of faith. Goes further to claim that when it comes to African Christians, the actual faith of the people may not always be identified with the official faith. And the official faith, many times, is at variance with the actual faith, or is often not fully intelligible to the faithful. This creates a challenge in many cases in terms of the normativity of what is presented in official teaching and the actuality of what the people believe and live. The priest told me that he went on a holiday, and in his small village, where there is not even electricity, on Christmas night, the parish priest was busy talking to the people about Thomas Aquinas, Summa Theologian. They don't understand what you're talking about. They don't. So, from a systematic theology point of view, in transcending ecclesial boundaries, the praxis of African Christianity, particularly expressed in actual faith of the believers, produces a list of criteria for this trans-denominational ecclesiology that I'm trying to articulate, and I'll try to present 3 of them. I'll try to do the French translation. So, the first one is that the praxis of trans-denominationality is dependent on the actual faith of the people rather than on dogmatic provisions. Consequently, there is no systematic articulation of the nature of such ecclesiology outside praxis. You can't find it in the book, you will find it in action. Second, the mechanism of displacement and non-replacement of normative denominational ecclesiology lies in the ability of believers to go out, and then come back without re-entry. Before, if you leave the Catholic Church, before you come back, there's always a formal ceremony to welcome you back. No, this time around, people go out, they come back. They go out the same day. They can go out the same day and come back the same day. And there's no need to officially welcome them back. And this is what is happening. The third one is that trans-denominational ecclesiological behavior is evident at the level of individuals, and so it is not a communal or ecclesial decision. For these individuals, a new way of being church is to be in and to be with. So to be in their own particular community and to be with others that are outside their own communities. So it is an existential blend between habitation, dwelling, and negotiation, seeking to use Robert Woodnor's popular concepts. Going further, I wanted to know, why is this happening within African Christianity? And I have some idea. I may be wrong. So I think it's something of a fruit of the African fluid spirituality. So the actual faith and the concept of African Christianity is derived from this spirituality that defines the African worldview as a worldview that is marked by interrelatedness of reality. And in this interrelatedness of reality, it functions within the ambivalence of the understanding of reality and identity, which defines the African particularity. Sorry, I'll put the French translation of this book by Elodie Ozuku, who has explored this concept of interrelatedness within African Christianity. And so when applied to African ecclesiological models like the Familia Dei, the principle of interrelatedness bridges the dialectical separation of identity and difference, and is characterized by warmth, solidarity, and intimacy that is not limited to intra-ecclesial life, but essentially aimed at transforming the world. So it's not just within, but it also goes out. And you can also read synodality with this, okay? And what this means is that there's no room for Christian exclusivism in this big vision, since the pursuit of wholeness involves a certain level of disinterestedness that is rooted in African metaphysics of interrelationality. This fluidity, if we investigate further, is a product of African type of monotheism. I know I'm speaking of Africa in a generic way, but I can say for most African traditional religions, there are some points of intersection. So in this African type of monotheism, we have the belief in the supreme being, under whom subordinate divinities serve. So this one and many has always been there. And so in the context of African religion, or religions, depending on what the one you choose, asserting that there is only one God may be quite compatible with accepting and even worshipping other gods, so long as the relationship between God and gods is understood to be one of subordination, not exclusion. Exclusion is the decisive point, not oneness. Exclusion is the decisive point, not oneness. And so the fluidity of African spirituality exhibits several values that I will try to quickly itemize here. So what are the foundations of this kind of fluidity? To the French one. Yeah. So the first is the pluralistic nature of African spirituality. So the multiple divinities in African religion define this pluralistic spiritual praxis and makes it possible to adapt to change and allow itself to absorb the wisdom and views of other religions. Unlike other religions that are resistant to such adaptation, for a typical practitioner, there is no conflict in his mind between his traditional African spirituality and another faith. They are not mutually exclusive. I think that even the possibility of the evangelization of most African communities came from this kind of openness. The openness to even listen to the Christians, to know what they're saying, and to take the values that they have. The second is that there's no exclusive claim to the truth. African spirituality recognizes the vestiges of truth in many other religions, and so does not make any exclusive truth claim. There is no absolutization of any knowledge or experience of the divine. Perhaps we can explain this by the absence of any central figure to say, okay, this is the one who received the revelation, or this is the community that received the revelation, like in Christianity or Judaism or Islam. The third point is the tradition of orality. African religion is not bound to any written text like others. Each tradition of orality highlights a fluid epistemological approach that opens the space where religious practices can easily shift, change, or be reinterpreted as long as it serves the needs of the adherents. So this sometimes the question of orality is downplayed, but it's a way of keeping or being open to wisdom. It's a way of being of allowing a religion to constantly renew itself. So that this is because once you write it down, what is written is written. You can't change it. The third is that there's no space for evangelization. So in African traditional religion, there's no space for evangelization, no space for proselytization. If you want to belong, good. If you don't want to belong, good. Because the quest for evangelization and for conversion is also at the root of many of the conflicts and the horrors of religion throughout history, whether the Crusades or the Jihad. The third is the prioritization of human agency. From an anthropological perspective, the traditional African religion practitioner understands the role of the human person in the definition of God. It is not God who defines God's self, but human persons who define God. Faith discernment in this context becomes then the responsibility of the individual who takes ownership of this anthropological existential mandate. This individual accepts that the locus credibus is not in the absolute being, but rather in the space between the individual and the many manifestations of the absolute, in the truths that are accessible to many. And the final point is that there's the point of utility of this faith. So what works? And when you approach this religion from what works, It becomes pragmatic and can shift. That's why it is flexible. Now, what on the future of how does this touch on ecumenism? And I want to share a few ideas of how transdimensionality can also help with the future of ecumenism. The first point is that, as a ground rule, participation within these sessions are non-discriminatory. An individual's primary ecclesial identity is neither denied nor suppressed. So, if your identity is not denied, you can mix up. That's the understanding. The second is that the realization of the common nature of the actual faith of believers could, at the subjective level, inspire greater tolerance and the rebuilding of ecclesial division within the historical context of African Christianity. The ecclesial division in Africa was introduced by the missionaries who came to the mission fields in their already divided states. In fact, it was within the mission field that they discovered how divided they were, and so started the movement for ecumenism. That's how ecumenism started. It started from the missions. The third is that perhaps this will serve to refocus dialogue on the areas of everydayness, the dialogue of life, because it has to touch on the actual faith of the people, rather than the often church dividing doctrinal debates. The actual faith of believers has a way of downplaying division while recognizing difference. It operates on an alternative logic. So the logic of efficient pragmatism, what works, rather than the principle of consistency, which tries to put everybody into order. And so I will just conclude with a few words. Like I said at the beginning, my paper starts with a question, and my paper will also end with questions. And I would like to say that there are many questions that are yet unresolved in this quest. And some of these questions, the first will be on whether this is the best means of seeking wholeness through relationality. I think one of the speakers also mentioned this point of, I think you were the one who mentioned about understanding a part by relating it to the whole. So is this a good means of, seeking this sort of Catholicity through some sort of relationality? The second is also the problem of, the practice of subjective syncretism. You mix a lot of things, whether they're working or they're not. So you just mix them. Or are we touching on the idea of cafeteria Christianity, not cafeteria Catholicism? In cafeteria Catholicism, you choose the doctrines that you want to believe or not. But in this case, we are talking about cafeteria Christianity, where you pick one denomination, pick maybe 3 or 4, and put them together. Finally, the question is also, there's also the question of unclarity regarding the type of normatology that grounds this kind of practice. So what sort of normatology do we find here? So thank you for being on this journey.
Thanks a lot for this really inspiring presentation. We heard 4 great lectures, and before we get into a discussion with them and with each other, we hear a translation, and this translation should also be a reminder to inspire us to comments, to questions, and so on. Please come forward to us.